In today's episode, we're about to cover some cutting-edge leadership and management ideas in the world of IT. Welcome to Ticket Volume, the podcast for people who love IT and are looking to learn. Powered by InvGate. I hope you're ready to hear some amazing ideas because today's guest needs no introduction. Rob England, formerly known as the IT Skeptic, a staple in service management and business thought leadership, author, co-author of some of the best books, and executive assistant to Dr. Charity Vu. Welcome, Rob.
Oh, thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining. I love that line that you kind of fed it to me when we met recently, that you're her executive assistant.
So for those who don't know, my wife and I are a team, and we call ourselves Teal Unicorn, which is a fusion of two buzzwords to make a good brand. And Cherry works in Vietnam and does amazing stuff there. So that would be really interesting, a conversation about the fact that she's actually doing this stuff that everybody talks about. I'm the philosopher of the pair who thinks more about the ideology and the conceptual background. And also I am her executive assistant. I make the tea and keep the technology working and carry the bags. And yeah.
I love it. So we should address the elephant in the room right away, because I said it at the beginning. So you've retired the IT Skeptic. Why?
I have. So everywhere I go in an IT community, there's usually like one or two people who know the IT Skeptic. So I think that's a great penetration, but it is still probably maybe even a minority of your listeners, right? Even though we're in that same community. But so for those who don't know, I had a blog for 14 years. Amazing. And 1,500 posts or something, I forget now, which I started as an experiment to try out this new thing called blogging, right? That's how long it was around. And it just got legs of its own and became this very skeptical view of the stuff that goes on within the IT community. Yeah, so after all that time, I retired him, and I talk about him as an alter ego. It was very much a different personality or persona that I took on. And so I retired him at, two years ago, I think. I was going to say 2019, but that seems like ages ago now. Was it 2020? Anyway, retired it because I think the need is as pressing as ever to take a skeptical view on stuff that is said and done in IT, and certain events that have happened with ITIL recently almost brought the IT Skeptic out of retirement. But it's just not me anymore. I think I've grown too nice to...
Your philosophical outlook on life has changed.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
yeah. But I find it hard to be sufficiently acerbic and curmudgeonly as the IT Skeptic requires.
Indeed.
And also, to a certain extent, I've moved on a bit from IT. That sounds wrong. That sounds patronizing. I don't mean it that way. But my interest is just elsewhere. Right?
Well, I think that's the natural progression of service management too. That I think that's why we've sort of removed the IT from ITSM, and I feel like we've gotten to the point where we're actually crossing that threshold where we are the business, we are part of the business is part of us. So it kind of makes sense that we know more about this. I've got another guest coming on, Suresh, who talks about this often, how leaders need to know what IT is doing and what IT is capable of, and vice versa.
Yeah.
There shouldn't be so much separation.
No. And one of the reasons the itSMF has a small I, small t in itSMF is they had that debate years ago about we should drop the IT, and didn't quite make it, but lowered the case as a compromised position.
I love the way that you talk on your website about what you're doing. We change how organizations, large and small, manage their work, including self-organized teams, servant leaders, simplified controls, flattening the hierarchy, profit sharing, continual improvement, learning culture, collaborative community. I think those are some of the concepts that we in service management are looking to embrace and enable in organizations. And so it makes sense that Teal Unicorn is pushing that at a leadership level, because that is what I think a lot of us need to survive these times.
Yeah, I think there are two important points in there. One is that leadership and management aspect, which is our passion, which is that in order to unlock new ways of working, you need new ways of managing. If you don't manage the people differently, they're incapable of working differently. So that's one aspect. And the other one is that service management is steeped in ideologies, almost some really deep philosophical thinking, which is dated. I'll put that right out there, that the scientific management and thinking of people as machines that can be measured and optimized is just obsolete.
Bingo.
And yet it's very difficult for service managers to let go of that, because it is so woven into the fabric of service management thinking to get us away from this, 5-level maturity and statistical optimization of process and organizational behavior management, OBM. Oh, I have a visceral reaction to psychological manipulation of people.
Excellent.
I believe it works, right? I believe you can treat people like Pavlovian dogs, right? I believe it works. I just think that the moment you think about your fellow colleagues and fellow humans that work that way, it's an unhealthy way of thinking about them.
Yeah, without question. And you and I, we've butted heads in the past. We've disagreed in the past, quite a bit actually on Twitter. I found actually last night that I had unfollowed you at one point.
I don't even remember why, of course.
Me neither. But you kind of are touching on what the subject of your most recent book series is on, that the Agile Manager, that sort of open management concept, the new way of leading. And I picked up your new book. I think that is actually the name of it, Open Management.
Yeah.
So the first book is kind of the how, right? How we work together. This one's supposed to be the why. Is that right?
Bit of product placement. There we go. Yeah. So the small A Agile Manager was about
the how,
the things we had learnt on what these new ways of management look like in order to enable these new ways of working. And so it had to also talk about these new ways of working too. And actually, I'm falling into that habit of calling them new ways of working. I'm trying to train myself to say better. Because a lot of them are not terribly new, right? From the start of the 20th century, as scientific management was rising, there was equally a movement from way back then to try and keep us more humanistic. And so the ideas are not wildly new, right? And Drucker talked about all this stuff several generations ago. Anyway, the better ways of working. And then I got all political or more political and felt like I needed to write about why we're driven. And there's this saying, values over value.
Yes.
If you're focused entirely on value, the dark side of that is Friedmanism, is the sole purpose of the organization is to enrich the shareholder. And that drove us to all the disgusting behaviors at the end of the 20th century, right? Of greed is good. So if you're totally value focused rather than being focused on a set of values, and one of the trendy sayings these days is stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism, where you deliver value to all the stakeholders in and around the organization rather than just that one stakeholder who happens to own it. And so that shift to values over value, I think, characterizes that book pretty well.
Yeah.
It's about that argument that there's more to the world than just generating value. And there's more to the world than just generating value for the customer too.
Precisely.
Right?
Yeah. We can serve more people.
You can sell cigarettes and say, I am delivering value to the person who wants to smoke. Or you can make armaments and you're delivering great value to the people defending Ukraine. So everything has its yin and yang, or its positive and negative.
Excellent. Yes, I love that point, that everything's got a positive and a negative. I got to the exposition part of the open management book, and I just love, there's one page specifically that I've got in mind where you start off talking about building humanity at work and understanding systems and adapting them to change strategies to make work better. And what's awesome is it kind of summarizes the entire book, and then at the end of the page it says, "That's it. That's the book. If you get all that, then we're done. Thanks for coming." And it's indicative of your writing style. You don't necessarily write. It's not the Unicorn Project. You're not writing a story to teach a lesson. It really is nonfiction, in a way that you can see the lessons learned, and then you can hear the anecdotes about why they were learned and how they were learned. I really like that format. It makes it much more accessible. And, I fell in love with the book after reading that, because it's just it puts into words so well the way that I want to work with people, for people,
Thank you. That's very kind. And that is very much the intent, is to just an exposition of ideas, and even a catalogue sometimes of ideas. I do tend to throw everything into the soup. And some people like that and some don't, right? So I tend to take a broad and shallow view of trying to just give people the entire landscape, rather than unpacking a single idea. So the open management book is a little bit more focused in that. It's looking into the ideology of it. And I'm working on another one now, which is even a bit more focused on the issue of planning in the VUCA world, in a volatile world, and how the world is changing. And we have to rethink how we think about the future.
Exactly. I love the way you said it the last time we spoke. You said it's how to plan, but it's also how not to plan, how to operate without a plan. That is a great concept. It's very cutting edge, because right now we're still in that mindset where everything follows a very linear structure. Granted, it's more rapid than it has been in decades past, but now we're reaching a threshold now where every day is changing how you're going to be operating as a business, because we can't avoid being political anymore. So I love the way that you say that, how not to plan. So how do you actually do that? How do you operate a business without a plan?
Well, I'm still learning, and I think the world's still learning. And there's a spectrum. But again, there's a lot of letting go of some principles that have been the foundation of our whole careers, which is always difficult. If I tell you the extreme position that I've discovered, it gives us an example of that range, is that arguably, if you cannot see the future, if the future is unknowable, which we should rationally accept as true, unless you're a psychic, the future is unknowable. All you can do is guess and bet and talk about odds.
True.
Right? You can't know. So therefore, if the future is unknowable and the only thing you know is your current state, then all planning is to some extent waste, and therefore perhaps you should only plan for the current, only plan for now, only plan for what you currently need, what you currently need to respond to, what your current issues are. And then if you always optimize for the present, as the world meanders through its VUCA reality, you'll be perfectly tracking the line. Whereas if you head off on some tangent based on what you hypothesize the future will be, you'll always be off that line as you're constantly correcting to come back to it. And so if you want to be optimal, maybe you shouldn't plan at all for the future. And, even I balk at that. It just intuitively is like, no. But it's also hard to fault the logic.
Yeah. I've seen this a couple times in my experience in marketing and in design, where we don't necessarily know what's going to work. It's unknown. It's unknowable. And building in your current state, you are able to build things and then test them and say, okay, today this is working really well, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to follow this path. And then, your next step might be backwards, and then you have to try that other thing. Or it might be forward if you're lucky, you guessed right and continue on that path. You've used that term a couple times, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I love that term. It's not something I'm used to using. I always just kind of say stuff's crazy. It's kind of the same meaning, right?
That's just as good a word for it. That is just as good a word for it. And you also alluded there to something which is to experiment. So definitely, I'm absolutely positive about this. Jerry and I are absolutely positive about this. And I think the world is now, that the rational way forward is to probe, is to experiment. And so at one extreme, the totally abstract philosophical, you've got Cynefin and Dave Snowden's thinking, and that model which talks about in complexity we probe and sense our way forward. And then at the very pragmatic level, you've got Agile, capital A, Agile, which is in fact an experimental philosophy, which says you iterate and increment in many small increments, and you constantly adjust to what you discover with each of those iterations. And that's sort of between the two. There's this whole spectrum of ideas, but they all reflect this. Finally, we're getting to an acceptance that you can't do a simple linear project plan for most work, because it denies the reality that with every step you take, things are going to change.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Another thing that I love about the book that I noticed right away, and I think this is right after the exposition, but you immediately differentiate work from knowledge work, and how knowledge work, I think the phrasing specifically was that knowledge work is invisible. And if you can't see it, then there is this almost impossibility to manage it. And I love that example as one of the reasons why we need to be more human at work, and why our individual contributors are stakeholders in the work. Because without that, there really is no point in even trying to manage.
Yeah, I think another way I like to phrase that as well is that you can't make knowledge workers do anything. So I talk about transactional workers as compared to knowledge workers. So people who are clerical, agricultural, labour, factory, who are assigned an individual transaction to do, and it's like turn this handle till you're dead, right? That's your job. And at one extreme, you've got transactional work, and at the other extreme, you've got pure knowledge work. And then a lot of people are on a spectrum in there where, it is a spectrum. It's not a nice binary thing, of course. So that's the distinction. And for pure knowledge work, it's completely invisible and it's completely collaborative. So it's always a group of people doing the work, which means you can't see what an individual is doing and you can't unravel what they're doing from the product. So there's a double whammy there in your inability to measure people. You can't see them and you can't unravel it from the team. And so that means that you can't treat them like a transactional worker. You can't measure their output and hit them with sticks till the output goes up, right? It just doesn't work. Dan Mezek taught me the word invitational, right? You can only invite knowledge workers to work, right? They need to want to do it. And so you can only create an invitational management environment where people want to produce the output. And that's so different from a transactional work. But it turns out that for transactional workers, if you treat them nice and invite them to work, they actually enjoy working more. Wow, gosh, who would have thought it? And you get better output as well. Because, especially in a VUCA world, come back to that word, because the transactional work only works in a tightly bounded system. So transactional work depends on linear flow. Right, it depends on being able to do a value stream map and draw the work and tell them that they do this thing over and over and
optimize.
Map the whole thing out and and automate it perhaps. And so, a factory floor is tightly bounded. It's bounded by concrete and machines to tightly limit what's happening to a linear flow, and it's tightly bounded by rules and management and abstract things as well. And once you've got that flow, then you can do theory of constraints and you can do lean. And this is why I get a little worried about our IT over fondness for manufacturing paradigms, because those paradigms are born out of transactional, linear, bounded work. And to a certain extent, we can apply them to knowledge work. But, software is almost pure knowledge work. And there's very little transactional work in there. The continuous delivery pipeline is a tightly bounded factory pipeline. So those ideas work quite well in a DevOps context for bounded flow, getting software from development to production. Yeah, great. But for the actual collaborative work of creation of software, or stepping back to the larger context of, this is the thing. The other thing about bounded linear flow is it's usually only at a very local level. You can see a nice simple flow, but the more you zoom back, the more that flow exists within a network of co-creating agents, right? So you set that work in the context of the other parts of the organization, of the suppliers and partners and customers and neighbors and society of the organization. Suddenly it's a really complex network of co-creating entities, and these ideas of flow, I think, are just lost in the noise. Suddenly you're in complex adaptive systems, and those ideas just don't work. And so that to me is the danger in IT, is we've become quite fond of lean, and as I say, in DevOps, but in any sort of broader context, we've got to be really careful to not lose humanity and to not lose the fact that it's a complex system.
Exactly.
And so it's unknowable.
Yeah.
One of the definitions of a complex system is it doesn't do things predictably.
Exactly. Yeah. You can't lose that perspective, because if you do what you're doing down here, you'll get it all wrong no matter what. It's all futile then.
And so coming right back to service management has the idea of optimization absolutely baked in, and yet you can only optimize that which is defined and repeatable. CMM, right? What is it? I can't even remember the 5 now, but defined, repeatable, managed. This is our goal in life, is to make work defined and repeatable. And we were talking about my other book, Standard and Case, last time we talked, which I wrote years ago or something. And so I've come a long way since, but that was my dawning realization that only some work can be made defined and repeatable, and other stuff is unknown and exploratory, and eventually maybe we'll get it to be defined and repeatable once we reduce it and transactionalize it, get back to that. But when we first encounter something new, it's pure knowledge work. There's nothing transactional about it. And so the idea of optimizing that is just wrong, fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. Taboo. Totally. There's no point to it. I love that. It's sort of, at a light level, standard and case, it is exactly what we're talking about. It is the outcome of where business has gone, where service management has gone. I didn't really realize how forward thinking it was 8 years ago when it came out, but it really...
Neither did I. This is the whole point. I've been on this journey since and look back now and go, oh yeah, that was a first glimmering. I wouldn't say forward thinking. I'd say a first glimmering, a first emergent symptom of this much deeper stuff that I've learned since.
I love it. Well, thank you, Rob. Thanks for coming. Where do people find you to learn more?
TealUnicorn.com or LinkedIn. I'm very Rob England on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn or Twitter.
Exactly. Yeah. Start a fight with Rob England if you can on Twitter. He'll greatly enjoy it. Thank you for joining today's episode. Find us on ticketvolume.com. Join us again soon for another edition, and find us on your favorite platforms. See you.
Thanks, Matt.